Bonsoir, French students. Comment allez-vous? Ça va? Okay, so I reviewed a couple of expressions there that are going to be useful for you no matter how much French you study or in what situations you find yourself. Comment allez-vous, of course, is how are you, but it's addressed to a group of people or maybe to a person you don't know very well. You have a formal relationship with them. Ça va, of course, is the more informal form, and you would use it with your friends, your family, people you know well. Okay, we'll come back to the word ça in just a moment. So the few expressions or questions that you see on this slide are going to be very useful for learning l'alphabet. Okay, this looks just like alphabet in English, right? It's the exact same spelling, just a different pronunciation in French. Remember that consonants at the end of a word like C, R, F, and L often are going to be pronounced, but all the other consonants won't be for the most part unless they're connected to a word that begins with a vowel sound, a liaison. Okay, so a couple of questions or three questions we can ask here to help us with spelling. Okay, so the first one we see here, ça s'écrit comment? Okay, so remember that I opened up this video by using the expression ça va. Okay, ça in ça va means that goes, or basically how's it going? How are you doing? Okay, and so in this case, and I apologize for all of those email notifications showing up, they just do that a lot. So anyway, ça s'écrit comment? The ça in this question is the exact same word that we see in the expression ça va, okay, and it means that. So it would mean right here, that is written how. That would be the literal translation of that question from French to English. But of course that sounds a little awkward in English, so we'll switch the word order around so it sounds more natural in English. How is that written? Okay, so ça, that, s'écrit is written comment, how. And you can even change the word order in French. You could say, comment ça s'écrit? How is that written? So it would be possible to do that. The second question you see there, ça s'écrit avec ou sans accent? So again, we have that is written, avec is with, sans is without, ou is or. And when we pronounce sans, with a word that has a vowel right after it, we're going to have the liaison. So it becomes sans accent. Ça s'écrit avec ou sans accent? So is that written with or without an accent? And we'll definitely be learning about accent marks very soon. It's important to be able to spell words correctly in French. And finally, the last question. Ça s'écrit avec un ou deux S en français. So that's written with one or two S's in French or in English, en anglais. Okay, and notice when I say deux S, normally the word deux, the X is silent. But in this case, since I'm joining it to S, yes, it's a consonant, but it begins with a vowel sound. So for pronunciation, I need to say deux S. So ça s'écrit avec un ou deux S en français ou en anglais. Okay, so those are some useful questions that you might have to ask somebody if you need to spell a word. And then on the next slide, we're going to look at the actual French alphabet itself. So what I will do is go through the different letters of the alphabet and pronounce them, and then the example name that comes right after it to kind of illustrate how that letter is pronounced in a word. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about the accent marks that we see over in the right corner here. Hey, A, Anne, B, Bruno, C, Caroline, D, Didier, E, Emma, F, Françoise, G, Gérard, H, Hugo, I, Isabelle, J, Jules, K, Karima, L, Lola, M, Margot, N, Nathan, O, Olivier, P, Pascal, Q, Quentin, R, Roman, S, Stéphane, T, Tristan, U, Ursula, V, Valérie, W, William, X, Xavier, Y, Yves, Z, Zoe. Okay, a few letters that I'm going to just point out to you to be a little bit more specific about them. Notice that the letter E in French probably sounded a little different than you might have expected. It's actually pronounced E. And there are various versions of this letter depending on the accent marks, but without an accent mark, it's going to be pronounced E. The other letters to pay attention to in English, we say G and J, but in French, they're kind of reversed and they're really easy to confuse. Sometimes I even still do it. So in the case of this letter right here that goes along with the name Gérard, is going to be G, which sounds like J in English, right? But in French, it is G. Okay, and the other letter that we see just below it is going to be pronounced G. It sounds a lot like G, the letter G in English, right? So it could be confusing. So just be aware of that. It's really easy to mix them up. Okay, so another letter I will point out specifically is the letter R. So in French, this can be a pretty challenging sound to make when you're a native English speaker. And this would be pronounced kind of like all the way in the back of your throat. So imagine you're kind of clearing your throat. You're trying to get something out of there. So it's R, kind of like gargling almost. My very first French teacher even gave us that advice. Stand in front of the mirror and pretend you're gargling, and that will help you make the French sound accurately. It's just a difficult sound. And the same for people learning English. When they learn the English R, it's pretty difficult actually, because that sound might not exist in their language. And it's the same for us. The French R doesn't exist in English, so it's just a little bit harder to pick it up at first. An interesting thing to note is that if you listen to a newborn baby, or a young baby who's starting to make sounds for the first time, they can make like every sound that all humans can make. But as you get older and you listen to people around you, your brain actually kind of trains you as you grow up to drop the sounds that you don't need anymore. So sounds that seem really unusual or really different to our ears as English speakers, they may be used in other languages, but we don't keep them in our sound inventory because we don't need them anymore if we're speaking English as our native language. And the same process happens in all languages across the world. So some sounds like U, the French U, or the French R, just feel difficult to us because we haven't needed those sounds since we were tiny, tiny babies. So that's a little bit of trivia there for you in case you ever need to explain that to somebody. Okay, so the only other sounds I would mention here would be for the sound X or X in French. Sometimes it's pronounced like Z, especially at the beginning of a word, like in the name Xavier. Y is often pronounced like I, as in the name Yves. So those would be some letters to point out. Finally, the last thing I'll mention would be about accent marks. So remember I told you before that the letter E in French is pronounced like that, but when you add accent marks to them, it kind of changes the sound of that letter. So if there is an accent aigu, and the accent mark is kind of pointing up to the right, the E, that sound, is going to transform to E. Okay? Or in the accent grave, if the sound is pointing kind of to the left like this, it's going to sound like kind of like the sound in the word bed. This accent aigu might sound similar to the sound in play. Okay? So similar, not exactly the same, but similar. The accent circonflexe, this is this little hat that's on top here. Sometimes this is used with la lettre E also, and it makes it also sound like the sound in bed. If it's on top of an A like this, it basically has the same sound, ah. Okay, sometimes you will see this little double dot called a tréma, and you might see that in a word like naive. And that's because naive is spelled N-A-I-V-E, and to make a distinction between the A and the E, naive, it's spelled with that little tréma over the I to show that they're separate vowel sounds. As I explained before with the word ça, that little tail on the end of the C, cédille, just turns it into a S sound. Apostrophes we know well in English. That usually shows possession. Like I can say, this is the student's book. The book belongs to the student. We would use an apostrophe to show that. Or we use them with contractions, like I can't instead of I cannot. In French, they're just used to kind of replace a letter that's been dropped. So in l'alphabet, normally we would need the full word like le or la. But since, the le and la both end in a vowel sound, we don't need to have that vowel sound there, or else it would sound strange, like le alphabet or la alphabet. It would sound strange to repeat the sound. So it's dropped and the apostrophe is used in its place. Okay, trait d'union is basically like a hyphen in English, and sometimes we see that in numbers, like 22, 23. It's used to connect it into one word. And then sometimes we might see two L's together in a word, deux L, and that basically just turns that into a y, kind of a soft y sound, like in the word cédille. Okay, so it just becomes kind of like that. So that's basically it. That's the French alphabet. That's how to ask some questions about how to spell words in the French alphabet. And that's it for chapitre préliminaire. Okay, we'll be moving on to chapitre 1 starting next week. So you'll take your exam for chapitre préliminaire and we'll be moving on. So I wish you all a good night, bonne nuit, and we'll see each other soon. À bientôt!